All right, so let's talk about some specific types of improvements that can happen on rangeland. The first one is improvement of riparian areas. So, riparian means flowing water. So it's not necessarily a stagnant stock pond or um, a water trough or stock tank. But this really refers to flowing water where you may or may not have um, aquatic life as a part of the riparian system. So you may consider an improvement to a riparian area if you have this type of situation over here to the left where there isn't any fence blocking animals from actually drinking here, and that animals are actually degrading the rangeland and sloughing off a bunch of topsoil into the riparian area as they are wading down into the creek to drink. So, riparian improvements tend to be very costly. There are some cost share programs out there, primarily through NRCS, and they can help you with things like fencing, so where you would fence off this area that's been compromised, um, planting willow bushes, some sedges, and some rushes or grass like species, as well as shrubs to help stabilize the bank. And the more vegetation that you have closer to the where the water actually starts, or where the water level is at, the more nutrient filtering ability you have, and that is going to contribute to the cleanliness of the water and the less amount of degradative products in the water, like sediment, nitrogen, all of that good stuff. So it increases the quality of the riparian area just by having vegetation as close to the water level as possible. Another type of improvement is to improve the actual number of plant stands you have. So this can be done a variety of different ways. Seeding with a tractor or an airplane. It can be done through fire. Decreasing or increasing stocking rate depending on what you're trying to improve and your rangeland region. Applying fertilizer to rangeland, it's not done on a regular basis. There's some instances that happens, but fertilizer is probably very low on the priority list because rangeland is so vast. And then also invasive species removal as well. And there's one other type of improvement to increase vegetation on rangeland that's becoming popular again. It was popular in the 90s and now it's back, is applying compost to rangeland. So I'm still on the fence with the compost issue. I think that there's some serious economic implications, and it would have to be very, very clean without any invasive species seeds in the material, or you could actually really hurt your rangeland very quickly. Another type of improvement is getting rid of undesirable plants. So one example is in the sagebrush steppe, in a pinyon juniper region. Junipers tend to be very invasive. They move in, take over, and they don't really have any natural predators. So you can actually change the vegetative stand over just a couple of years with the increasing amount of junipers. Um, and that's actually a big issue in the sagebrush steppe because they're trying to increase the sagebrush plants, which will hopefully increase the sage grouse populations. But junipers will take over very, very quickly and choke out the sagebrush. So one of the way that you can get rid of some undesirable plants are spraying with herbicides. You can log them, which is a mechanical removal. You can also burn. And then depending on what type of plant you're dealing with, you can use grazing to help control the spread of some of those plants as well. So you can also improve your infrastructure and put new infrastructure in, which may help improve the quality of the rangeland. So one way to do this is if you had old facilities that were run down and not functional, you could actually put in newer facilities and kind of double up on your goals. So if you wanted to strategically put in water sources, you could actually put the water source in the middle of a corral to where your sacrificial land would be only in one spot instead of in two spots by having the water separated from the corral. And this does a couple of things. It actually enables you to catch animals as they are going to be drinking water if you need to move them, and it's going to increase the plant growing acreage. So improving either improve or in facilities that have been run down or are not functional with new facilities, it is costly, but it can also really improve your management capability of that rangeland. Water development, this is different than riparian areas. So this is actually creating new water sources. So a lot of this is done by either putting in new stock ponds, new reservoirs, drinkers, or actually putting in new piping systems to new stockers and new drinkers on rangeland. So with water development, it's really beneficial if you can strategically place water so that animals are actually going to move to water and they're going to consume vegetation along the way. So if you have a 3,600 acre pasture and you only have one water source there, animals are not going to disperse out from that water source very readily because they need water a couple times a day. However, if you had 2 to 3 water sources in that 3,600 acres on different borders of the fence, animals would disperse out and consume more vegetation, which would give you more equal grazing among that entire pasture. A second type of improvement that has to do with water is, again, riparian improvement, which we talked a little bit about just a few minutes ago. But you could also improve riparian quality by implementing designated drinking sites. So actually in a riparian area like a creek or a stream, you would actually make improvements to a portion of that banking system so that animals like to go in and graze there or drink there, and they would leave the rest of the bank alone. So you could put in some of those improvements, like put in a bunch of gravel to where animals were stepping on that and not causing a lot of the topsoil to actually settle into the riparian bank. Fencing is one of the most popular improvements. When in doubt, you can put a fence in if you have decent terrain. So one of the ways to change grazing distribution is just by changing the area where animals can actually graze. So in this geospatial model, we have brown X's here that represent the fence. And this is at a ranch in Montana. And one thing that ended up happening to this very large pasture that has a lot of topography difference and altitude difference is they actually went in and put in a fence right down the top of the mountain to the bottom, and they were able to change the grazing distribution patterns of those animals. So another thing that they did is they traditionally had a fence that was over here towards the eastern border, and they ended up putting in another fence here in brown that actually pushed cattle off of this low ground up into the high ground. And so, because a majority of the cattle wanted to spend a large portion of their time down here on the flatland. So that has many different effects. Yes, your vegetation tends to be better, but you get more and more compaction and you get a lot of animal standing and compacted activity as well. So, sorry, this is still under management improvements, but another way you can do that is by strategically placing supplement or salt. So, we have, in this geo model, we have large pasture that is designated by the brown X's, and then the purple dots are GPS coordinates of one cow that was collared. And you can see here that that cow is a bottom dweller. So she stayed down where the elevation was pretty low. She didn't have to work very hard to find feed. However, by strategically placing supplement at the top of the mountain, we actually changed or can change her grazing pattern to move up to these other supplementation areas. So she's going to graze all the way up and she's going to graze back down, which means that she's going to utilize more forage in this pasture. All right, so the next step in this improvement process is your budget. So your budget for improvements tends to be very capital intensive, which means you need a lot of money at one point in time to make this happen. So the way to approach improvements is to budget and to save for improvements. So improvements can be implemented over time or all at once. It really depends on what type of improvement you are doing. There are cost share programs through NRCS, BLM, and some of the resource conservation districts as well. Farm Service Agency can give federal loans, and then there's also conservation easements where a third party would buy your development rights for a piece of land and give you cash in return. And then the last step of this improvement process is to assess your improvements. So the whole point of this was to put an improvement in to better the rangeland or make the rangeland a higher quality. So in order to reach that goal, you have to monitor to actually measure if you're reaching that goal or not. So these can be a lot of different things. Monitoring programs are made up of a lot of really simple observations and measurements. So it could be as simple as collecting the amount of precipitation every day, having a weather station on your rangeland, measuring forage production a couple times a year, change the rangeland ecological condition. And by doing the monitoring process and improving rangeland, you're going to end up creating more productivity in your livestock and in your rangeland. You're going to increase riparian health and soil and watershed health. You may also see an increase in wildlife populations and their ability to use the vegetation that you're creating as a result of these improvements. And that, in the end, may allow you to add more numbers of livestock to your pasture or to your entire ranch. All right, so that's the end of our improvements lecture. So make sure that you're including a couple of improvements and be strategic in your rangeland management plans and group projects. And remember the budgeting piece. You guys need to have money built in for budgeting your improvements.